All right, in this video we're going to talk about glazing, and first thing I'll say is I'm in the glaze room here. There's lots of different materials. There's 150 different types of dry materials. There's mixed up glazes, slips in different buckets. There's different different temperatures of glazes. What I'm trying to say is that this is a confusing room, and so if you're ever unsure of anything, just ask questions in this room. You can make very big mistakes in this room if you apply the wrong type of glaze to your piece and it goes into a kiln that you didn't expect it to go into, for example. And so things can end up badly for your work, but it's also can be you can make expensive mistakes if your glaze is fired in the wrong kiln. It's the wrong type of glaze and it flows off of your piece and it sticks to the shelves. That can not only damage the shelf and the shelf is ruined, but also the artwork that's sitting around your piece when it fires in the kiln. So anyway, just ask questions in here. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through a few things here. I will say there's several different, like I said, there's different types of glaze. So I'm going to show you the cone 10 glaze, and I'm going to show you the wall of testiles here in just a second. One of the things, I did make another video about the stain. So iron oxide stain is something that we use oftentimes in ceramics to accentuate texture and to create a kind of a worn surface. And so I did this other video, so I won't go over everything right now, but basically what I did here is I applied red iron oxide stain to this object and I wiped off the surface, and the stain stays in the low points here, and the high points get kind of wiped off. Where the stain stays in the low points, it's very, very dark. It's almost like a gunmetal black, and where it's been wiped off a little bit, it's more of a kind of a warm, dark, color. And so this is a great thing to use if you want to bring out some texture, or if you want that kind of worn look. And so just to show you, this is the container of red iron oxide red iron oxide stain. And stain is one of the things that can be on the bottom of your work. So you can see on the bottom here, there's some stain there. Now, you need to wipe it off a little bit. You can't just like pile the stain on there and just let it sit. Because then it will stick to the shelf. The other thing that can be on the bottom is the slip, the colored slip that we used during the process of you making your object. Remember, the slip has to go on when it's wet or leather hard. You cannot use the slip on bisque fired objects. So once it's bisque like this, it's too late for the slip. Okay, if you try to put it on, it'll just chip off. But you can see this object here, this person applied the slip to the bottom of the work, and this person could fire this on the bottom and that slip will not stick, okay? So the things that will stick are glaze. So any glaze, even if it's applied thinly, will make your object stick to the shelf, okay? So the only two things that you can also use underglazes, they won't stick, but we don't typically use those in beginning ceramics. So the things that we use in beginning ceramics that won't stick to the shelf are the colored slips and the stain. Okay, so so let's talk a little bit about how to apply glaze, and let's talk a little bit about picking the glaze color first. Okay, so this is one thing that you're going to want to make sure that you have time to really kind of consider the different colors and kind of make a plan. So you might, when you come in here, bring your sketchbook, and if you haven't done it already, make a little bit of a plan. Let's say I want, darker colors at the top and lighter colors at the bottom or something. And that way, when you walk up to the testile wall, you can kind of have a plan for what you're looking at here. Okay, so I'm going to pick up the camera here. And I am actually going to, let's see. Okay, I'm going to try to do it this way here. Okay, so this is the testile wall, okay? And so the testile wall is composed of all of our shop glazes, which are these glazes down here. Okay, so there are 13 of these. And so these are just the glazes by themselves. And if you notice, many of the glazes have two different colors here. Okay, so there's this particular glaze is Horsley Satin Matte White. This up here is one dip, and this is two dips. Okay, so if you look at this guide, it says thin application, hold for 3 seconds, thick application, hold for 6. And that means hold it in the bucket for 3 seconds. Okay, so this will show you what a thin application is, and this is the thick application. So on these tiles, some of them, you know, if you look at this, the Cushing's black looks pretty much the same. Okay, but right next to it, the Liz Krauss Chino is quite a bit different. Okay, so you have a thicker application here and a thinner application. Okay, and so the way that you read these tiles are, if you look at that, this is a guide for how to read the tiles. So you can see that the two upper right quadrants are glaze A, and then the bottom left quadrant is B over A, and then the bottom right is A over B. Okay, so let's just say that you want this color right here. So then what I would do is I would look at this here and say, okay, that's glaze A over the top of B, okay, when I apply it. So I go back and I look and I go down the line and I see iron saturate here as the B glaze. And I run my finger up here and I say Horsley's Satin Matte White is the A glaze, okay? So that tells me that Horsley's Satin Matte White over the top of iron saturate will yield this color, okay? Now, I will say that these are approximations, okay? So every firing is a little bit different. You know, the clays are a little bit different. There are a lot of variations just inherent in glazes. But generally, you know, this is what you look at. So this will show you the over-under combination of all the different glazes that we have in the studio. These here are cone 10 glazes. So cone 10 glazes are what we use for anything that is designed to be functional. Okay, so if it's utilitarian and it's going to hold food or liquid, then you want to use these glazes. Okay, so okay, let me turn this back around and put this here. Okay, so utilitarian. So that's an important thing, because if you're making like a functional object that you want to hold liquid, and you want to have it be a safe object for you to use to drink out of or to eat out of, then you want to, generally in this studio, you want to high fire and you want to use your high fire glazes. Okay, so cone 10, high fire, those terms are kind of interchangeable. We use those a lot. So we'll say, oh, this is, I'm glazing this with high fire glaze, or I'm glazing this with cone 10 glaze. We'll learn in one of the other talks that cone 10 is a temperature that we fire to. So you don't have to know this for this particular talk, but cone 10 is 2,345 degrees. So it's one of the higher temperatures that we fire to in ceramics. One of the first things we're going to want to do once we pick out our color, we make a plan, always write it down, right? So even if you're just going to apply like 2 glazes, write them down, because once you start pulling the buckets out and mixing things up, it can get a little confusing. So one of the first things that we're going to do is, actually, you know what? Yeah, okay, I'll do the stain one in a second. One of the first things we're going to do is just wipe our bisqueware off with a clean sponge and a little bit of water. Okay. Now, if you have a big, complicated sculpture, you can use the compressed air in the loading dock area. Okay, and just blow off the dust. The important thing here is that what we want to do is get the dust off of our object. So you don't know what happened in the kill room yesterday. Maybe somebody was in there grinding a shelf or something and there's a bunch of dust everywhere. That dust can settle on your piece and it can create basically a barrier between the wet glaze and the and your bisqueware. okay? So, so the way that bisqueware works is that this is porous. So when I dip this in the bucket, the glaze like sucks to the surface of the piece, and it creates a really nice flat seal there. Now, if you have something in the middle of that, some dust, for example, it's not going to adhere. It'll look like it's adhered, but then when it fires, it'll crawl. It's a thing we call crawling. Crawling is where the glaze will separate off of different parts of the work. So you can kind of see here, this glaze crawled and separated, and now this is a bare clay area here. Okay, so so crawling is exacerbated by a really thick glaze, so you don't want to apply your glaze too thick. There's several reasons why you don't apply your glaze too thick, but crawling is primarily caused by dust and not wiping the dust off. So make sure you wipe the pieces down, and then make sure you don't glaze too thick. And if you do both of those things, then you shouldn't have an issue with crawling. Okay, so when we're talking about thickness, what we want to do, our goal is to apply the glaze about the thickness of a thumbnail. Okay, not the thumb itself, but the thumbnail. I'm assuming we all have relatively even, like the thickness, like we all have around the same thickness of a thumbnail. But generally a thumbnail, or like, a couple playing cards thick, it's not, that's pretty thin. Okay, so you want to apply it, you don't want to apply it too thick, because the other thing that can happen when you apply it too thick is it can run. Okay, now some of the glazes on the wall of color run anyway. Okay, so if you see a tile that has a kind of a pool of glaze at the bottom, so those tiles were fired at an angle like that in the kiln, and so that means that if the glaze was really super liquidy when it was firing, then it runs down and it kind of pools up towards the bottom of the tile. So if you see a bunch of glaze kind of pulled up at the bottom of the tile, then it's a glaze that runs a little bit. So running can look great on a piece if it doesn't stick your piece to the shelf. Okay, so on this particular piece, it looks pretty cool because it ran down and it didn't come to the bottom here. Okay, but this piece here, this ran down and it got stuck to the patty that it was on. Now we fire things on these patties, okay, and so this will, this piece in the kiln was sitting on this patty like that, okay, and you can see that glaze ran onto that patty. If your glaze runs onto the patty, that's not the end of the world. You can usually chip these off and you can grind that. Now you'll have a ground surface there, so it'll look different. But what we try to do is just avoid that. Now if you really glaze thick, it'll actually run around the patty and it'll stick the whole unit to the shelf. And that's when your piece is ruined. The shelf needs to be ground down, and it's not an easy thing. So we try not to do that. Okay. So so now that I got my piece wiped off, I'm actually gonna glaze this one. So this is the one that I demoed in one of the other videos about the stain. So I'm gonna do the inside of this one first, and then show you how to just kind of layer a few things. So okay, let's see. How am I going to do this? Okay, so I am going to mix up a couple of the different glazes here. So I have the iron saturate, which is right here, and I have the Monica Seafoam, which is here. Now I've already picked out this color, and it is here. Okay, so this is generally what it should look like. Now I look at the bottom right-hand corner of this tile. Then I know if I look at that guide up there, it says A over B. So this tells me that the top glaze here is Monica Seafoam that I need to put over the top of iron saturate. Okay, so I am going to mix up the iron saturate and apply that first, and then I will brush some Monica Seafoam on there. Okay, so I'm going to, let's see here. This is hard to do with one hand here. Okay. When you are stirring the glazes, and you're going to stir this one here, always cover this one. Okay, it's right next to each other. So cover this one up so that I don't splash anything in there. Okay, and so just be mindful of what is around you when you're stirring. Okay, so what you're going to want to do is make sure that the drill goes all the way to the bottom of the bucket, and you're going to stir this as fast as you can without it spilling over the side. Okay, so just try not to get it to splash, and make sure that the bucket, that you feel the bottom of the bucket with the mixer, and make sure that the you're not getting you don't have clumps of glaze down there. Okay, you can look at this too, and you can also see if there's clumps actually on the mixer. Okay, so now I've already mixed this right before I did the video, so it's pretty well mixed. So I'm gonna just kind of make sure it's in suspension, and then I'm going to top that, and I'm gonna put this into that water. Okay, so the important thing to think about when you're mixing this is you mix it every time you use it. Okay, so just like the stain, the materials in those buckets, they sink. And so you don't want to, you want to make sure it's mixed and it's suspended in the glaze so that you don't get like a really watery top layer, basically. So I'm going to get a scoop here. Okay. And let's see if I can angle this down so you can see this here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I have a scoop of glaze here, and I'm going to glaze just the inside. Okay, so I'm going to pour some glaze in here. Okay, not all the way full, about 3/4 of the way full. And then I'm going to kind of roll it like this. Try not to pour it onto the floor or in front of me. Okay, and I want the glaze to be in there for about 5 seconds. Okay, so now that it is, I'm going to dump it out rather. Then I'm going to hold on to the feet of my pinch pot, and now I'm going to just dunk the top edge and the rim. Okay, and what I just want to do is I just want to come down a little bit on the edge. On the edge there, and it's okay. I got a little bit of a drip there. If you don't want that drip, you can just take your sponge and you just wipe it off. Okay. Now I would come back and I'll put a little bit more stain there because now I've wiped the stain off too, but that's okay. So the glaze, if the glaze gets anywhere that you don't want, if it gets on the bottom or anything, even if it's dried, you can wash it off. You can wipe it off with a sponge. Okay, you just can't obviously after it's fired. So that's basically how you would glaze the inside of your pinch pot. Okay, so now I'm going to stir the Monica Seafoam. I'm going to set this aside, and then I'm going to cover this again. Okay, and then I'm going to take my Monica Seafoam. I'm going to clean this off a little bit here. And I'm going to stir this. Okay. Now, I don't know if you can see in the video, but I did have a little bit of splashing. Not a big deal because I closed the lid of the bucket next to me, so that's okay. Okay. Now I'm going to pick this up here so that you can hopefully see it a little bit better. And let's see if I can adjust this a little. Okay. So now the color that I want for the color that I picked out on the wall of color, okay, the Testile Wall. I could, if I wanted to, I could apply this glaze over the whole thing, okay? But what I want you to do is when you do your pinch pots, I want you to experiment with the brushing, okay? So that's there's several ways to apply glaze, okay? So the dipping that I just did in the other bucket, that's one way. Brushing is another way. Pouring the glaze, so I could take a glaze and I could pour it over, and maybe that's what I'll do on the next one here, and spray it. So those are the kind of the four main the ways of applying glaze. So you have dipping, brushing, pouring, and spraying, okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just experiment a little bit with, I'm going to make these kind of polka dots on here. And I'm going to kind of build that glaze up a little bit. What you want to do, I want you just to kind of experiment with the colors a little bit so that, you know, when you get to applying glaze on some of your other pieces, you know, you'll have a little bit more experience and you'll see some of the different colors that they make. Okay, so you can kind of see what I'm doing here is I'm just applying these polka dots. Now, you know, the brush work and stuff that you can kind of see, most of that will just flatten out, okay? So I'm not going to see the brush strokes here, okay? There are a few glazes that you can kind of see the brush strokes, like Chino would be one of them. But for the most part, the brush strokes will flatten out. Now that is not the case for slip. So the colored slips, when you use those, if you see the brush strokes, they will be there when it fires, okay? So glazes are different than slips in that they run and bleed together. So slips don't run or bleed, okay? Glazes will smooth and kind of flow, okay? So some glazes, like I said, the runnier ones, those glazes will really run and they'll really flow. But most glazes, or all glazes really, will bleed together. Okay, so that's one of the big differences between, you know, using a glaze for a pattern and using a slip. Okay, so I'll just kind of speed this up and call it good here, and put a little bit on, a little bit extra. Now you can remember, you can, you know, when you're experimenting with your pinch pots, you know, if this runs, it's not a big deal because it's going to flow towards the middle of the object, okay? So you can feel pretty free to experiment with the colors and the patterns and everything, okay? Now, this glaze here is, the glaze in the bucket really has no relationship, the color of the glaze while it's wet has no relationship to the color of the fired glaze, you know, when it's done, okay? So that red glaze here, this is black when it fires, okay? So this glaze here is a dark green with a sort of speckly white color in there. So sometimes you'll see blue glazes that are pink, sometimes you'll see blue glazes that are tan. Okay, so just remember, it doesn't have any relation to what's in the bucket, okay? So, okay, so that piece is done. I might touch that up a little bit there where I wiped that drip off. But then I would go put this on the cone 10 shelf to be glazed, or to be fired rather. So make sure it's on the cone 10 shelf because you use cone 10 glazes and you have cone 10 high fired clay. Okay. Okay, what else? We're going to talk about the another object here in terms of, so if you were, so on these pinch pots we didn't glaze the outside, okay, but if we were, like for this piece right here for example, if I were to dunk that in there, I usually would start on the inside. So even with sculptural objects, I would recommend you glaze the inside first, is usually the way to go. Not every single time, but most often. And then the outside, the trick is if you're going to glaze down here to the bottom, you want to be about a 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch off of the bottom. Okay, let me adjust this just a little bit. Okay, so you want to be up to here, okay? If you're too close to the bottom, the glaze will run, okay? It'll stick your piece here. Some glazes run more than others, so if you see a glaze that is running a lot on the tile, then you might want to have it a little farther up, okay? Now this particular piece has a little bit of a lip. When I threw this, there's a tiny, tiny little bit of a lip here. So that would be a logical place to end the glaze, like when I'm glazing the surface. So if your object, whether it's a sculptural object or a pot, if you have a natural place to end the glaze that would look good, then, you know, end the glaze there. This particular part right here, this is exposed, okay, or will be exposed. So what I might do is I might stain that bottom, okay, to get a little bit of a darker surface, then glaze this down to here, okay? So, you know, so just make sure you cannot have any glaze on the bottom, no matter what. It can't be, you know, even if it's thin, okay? If you dip your object and it spills on the bottom, not a big deal, just wipe it off, okay? And wait for it to dry. Like if I dip this in here, and then I go like that and it runs on the bottom, don't then grab your piece and wipe it off right away, because you're gonna smear all the glaze that you applied here. So remember, the glaze can be dried on the bottom and you could still wipe it off, okay? And you just wipe it off with a damp sponge. You do not need to wax the bottoms of your pieces, okay? There are a small percentage of objects that will benefit. It'll make it a little bit easier to glaze those, but for the vast majority of pieces, I would say like 98% of the pieces that are made, you do not need to wax the bottom. So sometimes you'll see people doing that. You spend all the time waxing it, then you got to let it dry. Okay, so it's going to slow down your process even more, and then you still have to wipe the glaze off of the bottom. Okay, so you know, so just skip the waxing part and just wipe it off. Okay, so so this object, I would pour the inside and I would dip the outside, and I would just make sure that when I dip it, I would hold it like that, and it would come right up to there. Okay, if I had a little mark for my finger, I might just leave that because I like the decorative aspect of it. Or if I wanted to fill that, I would just take whatever glaze I use and just kind of dot it there like that. Okay, so now the other question I get a lot of is, do I need to put a clear glaze on the glaze to make it look shiny? And the answer to that is no. If it's shiny on the wall, on the Testile wall, you know, it'll be shiny when it's fired. So the clear glaze is used over the slips. So you could, like in this object here, whoever this person that made this, if they wanted it to be really shiny and clear, they would use a clear glaze over this, okay? So even though there is slip on the bottom, the slip won't stick, but the clear glaze cannot be on the bottom. It will stick to the shelf, okay? So they would clear glaze down to the bottom here, or they would do some other decorative pattern, or maybe they leave the outside kind of exposed and the clear glaze is only on the middle, or on the inside rather. Okay, so you only need to use, generally you use the clear glaze if you're going over slip. Okay, we do have a test tile for the clear glaze here, just over the stoneware. It's kind of a shiny gray color. Sometimes we use that, but it's not typically used for areas that you're not going over a slip. Okay. Okay, so some of the main, I'm trying to remember everything that you need to know here. So some of the other, just really kind of driving home the point of not glazing it too thick. If you glaze it too thick, it's going to run all over the shelf, all over the patty, and then you're going to get the Golden Chisel Award. Okay, Golden Chisel Award is not an award that people want to get. It's an award where you have to chisel your piece and probably other people's pieces that are around yours off of the shelf, and in the process of chiseling it off, they break. So that's not great. So remember that you're going to stir the glaze every single time you use it. Even like, so this glaze here, you can't really see it, but it's already got a film of water, and it's only been 5 minutes since I've used that. Okay, so even if somebody else tells you in the room, oh, I just stirred that, you don't need to stir it. Just go ahead and stir it. Okay, make sure that when you're stirring it, when you take this off, or when you take this out of the bucket, make sure and see like there's a little bit of glaze there. Okay, so I would just take my sponge and just wipe this off and make sure that, you know, there's no glaze to contaminate that. Okay. Also, make sure that, you know, when you're putting these glazes back, always make sure that the right lid goes on the right bucket. And before you use the glaze, always verify that it's the glaze you want by looking at the label on the side of the bucket. Okay, so sometimes people are in a hurry, they might you know, accidentally put the lid on the wrong bucket or something. Make sure that you always look at the side, okay? When you're done, always put the glazes back and then get the mop from the main studio and mop in here, okay? We want to make sure and keep this room clean so that we don't track the glaze materials into the other, you know, into the other rooms. Okay, so what else? We got thumbnail thickness. We got our stain and slip that can be on the bottom. We got our you know, glazing off of the bottom about 1/4 of an inch so it doesn't stick. We talked about the patties. We talked about the stain there. We talked about how to read the wall of color. So remember, A glazes go across the top, B glazes go vertically, and then the lower right-hand quadrant is the A over the B glaze, and the lower left-hand is the B over the A. Remember that when you are looking at those, that is 2 layers dry, okay? So don't ever mix the glazes together. Okay, that's just like a big no-no in ceramics. Don't take a 1 wet glaze and mix another wet glaze together. It's not like paint. It'll create some sort of crazy hybrid monster that'll take over the world. Okay, so don't mix the glazes like that. You can layer glazes, and that's what the Testile Wall tells you. You can layer glazes for different colors, but make sure that the first layer is dry before you put the second layer on. Generally, that will only take a minute or 2. Okay. If your piece is really damp, like if your bisqueware is pretty damp from when you wiped it off, you know, that can take a little bit longer. It shouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes. Okay. But make sure that first layer is dry. If you can't touch it without it smearing, like if you touch it and it smears off on your finger, then it is too wet to apply the second glaze. Okay. So just remember that that's really important, because glazes are a complex set of materials. Some of these glaze recipes have 10 different ingredients. Each ingredient can have many, many different components in it. So there could literally be 50 different things happening in each glaze. And when they come together, if they mix wet, that you never know what it'll do. It could run all over the shelf. It could be a completely different color. It could bubble and boil all over the surface and be horrible. So you don't need to do that. Okay, so make sure that the layers are dry. So just remember, we call this cone 10, high fire. We also sometimes call it reduction glazes. So those 3 terms are kind of interchangeable. So reduction, cone 10, high fire. Generally, for the most part, we call them cone 10 and high fire. But reduction is a firing process that we reduce the amount of oxygen in the kiln to create the colors that you see here. Okay, so in another video, we'll talk about the temperatures and more about the firings and everything like that. So I think that's it. Just remember, have a plan when you come in here. Write everything down. Always, always write whatever you put on the piece. Okay, so if you had a plan and your plan changed, when you're done glazing, write down the glazes that you use, because the firing process is going to take a little while. So it might be a week or more until you get the piece back. Maybe it's 2 weeks or 3 weeks even. In the interim, you probably have forgotten the exact glaze pairings that you use. Okay, so if the piece is amazing and you didn't write it down, then you can never replay. You can never, do that over again. So make sure that you write everything down. Or conversely, if it's the worst thing you've ever seen, you want to make sure you don't do that again. So make sure you write everything down, okay? And then also, if you see glazes that somebody else used and you say, wow, that's really amazing. That would look awesome on my face jug, or that would look awesome on my other project. Ask them, these glazes are, the glaze recipes are shared. We in ceramics like to share information and help each other out and help our community out by being helpful to one another. So, if you have something that, you say like, wow, this glaze doesn't look great on my piece, but it might look awesome on that person's piece. Go let them know that. Say, hey, I tried this glaze. I don't love it on this particular piece, but it might look great on yours. And here's what I tried. So help each other out that way, and just ask questions. And I think that's it for the glaze talk here. And so again, just have a plan, and kind of be a little bit careful in here with the materials, and ask questions if you're unsure of anything. So I think that's it. All right, thanks.